Welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of the webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. Now, the association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept, and the association is now welcoming new members. In this session, we welcome Dr. Cary Wu for a presentation and discussion about minority racial concentration and COVID-19, the mediating role of social capital. Dr. Cary Wu is an assistant professor of sociology at York University. His research focuses on political culture, race and ethnicity, and inequality. He often shares his research with the public via national and international television, radio and newspaper forums, including NPR, CBC, CTV, and the Washington Post, Toronto Star, Maclean's, and The Economist. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Cary Wu for this session, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you, Tristan, for inviting me to be part of this series. I know that you have been doing this for a long time. It's really promoting lots of great research on social capital and how that matters, and then where does social capital come from, accumulated, all that. So today, what I'm going to talk about is racial minority concentration and then COVID-19 infection, and then focusing on the role of social capital in this relationship. Well, we know that the pandemic has unequal impact, right? So in particular, that some people suffer more, right? In terms of infection, for example, race and ethnicity is kind of like consistent predictor for those unequal impact. Two very well established pattern is that infection rates are higher individually among racialized or race ethnic minority groups, right? Particularly from my experience and the data analysis focusing on Canada and the US is like very, very consistent pattern, except for Asians, right? Asian in Canada and in the United States, they report lower infection rate. So that's one exception, but there's more explanation toward how Asians can be different in terms of their background. But for this talk, I'm not gonna get into that. Second pattern is also related, is that in places where there are more racial and ethnic minorities, infections are higher. So that's the one is individual pattern, second is the place level pattern, right? So when we think about why this the first individual pattern, then we often talk about like social determinants of health or social inequality, right? Racial, ethnic minority, for example, they tend to have poor health condition prior to the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, then all those complicate, and then maybe immunities and all that then lead to higher infection rate. Second is the inequality in terms of what kind of work they do, or like even the on the street kind of like living conditions, and then lower access to those like hospitals or healthcare centers, so less likely to get tested, for example. And then lower trust and connection and social capital, those individual explanations why, for example, racial or disadvantaged minority groups tend to report higher infection rate, right? Also, potentially, there's a place level explanation that it's not the individual factors that lead to higher infection rate among racial ethnic minority, but simply because they live in a places, neighborhood, communities where there are more infections, right? So it's not about their health condition, it's not about their trust or access, individual access to the resources, but simply, okay, they live in this neighborhood. Well, the neighborhood creates certain impact on the infection. So that's the second pattern, right? So equally healthy individuals, or equally in terms of like social economic status, they might suffer more from the pandemic simply because the neighborhood as a whole, right? So the neighborhood can generate causal impact on individual suffering through the pandemic. So there's something about the neighborhood that goes beyond the individual, right? So this is like a debate between these two political leaders. There's really something, there's no such thing as a society that during the pandemic, but this is way before the pandemic, they will talk about that. Don't blame the government, don't blame the society. Individual be responsible to things going on with the individual, right? But then during the pandemic, even Boris Johnson said that there's indeed such a thing as a society, or here, as a neighborhood, as a community, right? There's something about the community, something about the group or collective level, there's something could create independent impact on individual that individual has no control over with, right? So that's the kind of the topic we are getting here. So at the neighborhood level, when we think about places where there are more racial ethnic minorities, there are more infection rates, the type of theory explaining the association. First is just demographics, right? So maybe certain demographics, for example, lower immunity or poorer health condition could suffer more, or older generation or people in terms of people demographic. Second is about vaccination rate. This comes later on, right? But I disapprove this theory for a couple of reasons. First, the racial ethnic patterns were documented long before the vaccines became available, right? So it's nothing to do with like whether people, the variations in vaccination status, right? Because the patterns document before. So that's one. Second is that even later on, more recently, right? For example, my research shows that in Canada and in the United States, where there are more racial and ethnic minorities, the higher vaccination rate more recently, driven by mainly by political ideologies, right? So for example, in the US, people from conservative ideologies, they are less likely to get them vaccinated. But even today, the pattern still, the race and ethnic differences in infection is still very well established, still persistent. So the point I'm making here is that vaccination cannot explain the differences, racial and ethnic differences in infections, right? And then a third theory is really focusing on socioeconomic or neighborhood vulnerability, right? So those access to resources, opportunities, and the main racial and ethnic differences in social determinants of health create those patterns, right? And then key say the focus here is the neighborhood effect, right? Racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to live in places where there's a neighborhood effect that create those patterns, right? So when we talk about the neighborhood effect, what are we talking about? Like from the literature, especially from like Chicago sociology and then Sampson, for example, when we think about the neighborhood effect research, we focus on the effect of one is inequality, right? So the community level inequality. When there's inequality, that create a lot of like crime, violence, and create a lot of like impact. On the other hand, it's really the major thing about neighborhood effect is really about something about the neighborhood is that the mutual trust people have in each other, the cohesion, right? And the collective efficacy as a group, as a collective community level that is beyond individuals' control, right? So what is about the neighborhood, then social capital is a concept that really can capture the features of neighborhood condition, right? The social organizations, formal and informal norms, mutual trust people have each other, and then also the collective efficacy, right? So really in the neighborhood effect research, scholars highlight those, something that related to social capital, right? So that's why I'm here to say that social capital can play a role in kind of like making sense of why racial minority concentration is related to COVID-19 infections, right? So a little bit about the concept of social capital. We talk about the concept of social capital. This one is a multi-level concept, multi-level in terms of like individual, collective, right? So we can also think about social capital as some people have more social capital, for example, trust or relationship, positive relationship or connection or social support, or higher even a self efficacy, right? So that's at individual level. At collective level is that community or society as a whole has more this trust, mutual trust going on, or relationship or more connected, right? So that's the collective property or property of the cities, communities, or even countries, societies, right? So that's the multi-level nature. And second is multi kind of dimensional, right? So when we think about social capital, we always conceptualize or define social capital in terms of forms, right? Different forms. Talk about efficacy, we talk about network, we talk about the trust, and including political trust and social trust within each other, right? So this multi-dimensional. And then also in terms of multi-dimensional is that there's the nature of social capital, the effect of social capital can be positive, can be negative, right? So a lot of research, more recent research arguing for example, the downside of social capital, that sometimes social capital can create negative impact, right? And then finally is contextual, meaning that social capital in different forms and at different levels can create different impact across different contexts, right? So today I will demonstrate, for example, at different point in time during the pandemic, the role of social capital can be different, right? But when we also think about the political context, right? In more democracies, for example, maybe we rely more on social capital in a way that is more bottom-up social relationship, right? But in more authoritarian regimes, maybe we rely more on top-down. And then that it could be in terms of political trust as a way of social capital, less on like individual trust, social trust in each other, but more political trust or institutional trust, hierarchical, right? So contextual. Context matters how social capital can create different ways of shaping social outcomes, right? And then another thing is in terms of context, also the time dimension, right? Sometimes during the event, that social capital could also change its role in determining social outcome, right? So that's very important to think about social capital, the concept. So during the pandemic, I spent quite time researching about like the social capital role in the pandemic. So the first paper I published is really like at very early on during the pandemic, thinking about testing, right? So not just COVID infection, but more like who are willing to go get tested, and then which places or communities or states you see more people are getting tested, because early on in the pandemic, getting tested is a critical approach to really limit the spread, right? So, but you see some people are less willing to get themselves tested than others, right? So the first article I published is really looking at in the United States when they have data reporting variations in COVID-19 testing, not even infection, because very early on, we don't have that data. We'll still figure out a way to collect all those infection cases, but we have data on testing, right? And then the clear pattern is that in communities where social capital is high in terms of trust, and in terms of like Putnam index of social capital and other measures of social capital, we see a clear, strong association between testing and levels of social capital. And then that speaks to, I'm thinking, during that time, I'm thinking about social capital and the forms really related to the quality of institutions, the quality of government, right? So for example, in Putnam's work in 1993, making democracy work, the key argument he's making is that social capital is high in places where social capital is high, quality of government is high. So that promote, for example, economic growth and all those institutions that lead to better social outcome, right? So that's the kind of first article. And second, when we have those data across the US, and then we also look at counties, like more than 3,000 counties in the US, then you see, like, for example, this is one plot plotting how the level of social capital across the states and the level of infection rates across the state. You see exactly how strong they are, these two variables associated, right? And then later on, I move into more theoretical ways of thinking about how, like, why, right? Why social capital matters, and then through kind of which channels that social capital create impact on weathering the pandemic. So then I'm thinking about the level, the time, and then the dimensions and all that, and really trying to theorize different ways of capturing the diverse effects of social capital, and try to figure out the mechanism through which social capital impact the social outcome and then pandemic. And then one kind of conclusion from here is really that social capital at individual level, the norms and then trust lead to more higher compliance with control measures, right? And then more concern about other people. Like when people have more trust, when people have more trust in political leaders, they are more likely to follow those control measures. They are more likely to practice, for example, social distancing, and they have greater concern of others, and they were more likely to wear masks and all that. So that's the key mechanism that really helping connecting social capital and then the COVID-19 infection rate. And there's also one thing is about time, right? So during the time when we have those policy thinking about controlling the pandemic in the US and in Canada, for example, the lockdown measures, right? So we see the differential, the changing impact of social capital, right? When there's more strict policies, the role of social capital become more smaller, right? So when there's no policies early on in the pandemic, the role of social capital is greater relative to when there's strict policies. When there's strict policies, then the social behaviors, social actions rely less on social capital, but more on those policy controls, right? So that's the time dimension and context. So very, very important. So back into this study is that in Canada, we documented, very well documented, that is both in Canada and the United States, right? So places where there's more racial and ethnic minorities, there are more infection rate, right? So that's, for example, this is across Canada, and then the percentage of Black population, Black Canadians, and that related to the infection rate. So very consistent pattern in Canada and the US. So my study here is that really try to think about what explains the connection, the association between racial minority concentration and then COVID-19 infection, right? So this is across Toronto neighborhood. So my focus here is the city of Toronto, and then we have 140 neighborhood. So if you know the city, you will get the idea that there's places where there are more racial and ethnic minorities, there are more higher infection rates, right? And that conceptualize social capital only on neighborhood level, so it's not individual property. And then in the forms of three key components that largely conceptualize like what main forms of social capital in terms of trust and norms and networks, right? And then I use data sources, I combine multiple sources of data one key source is from the city, where they collect those infection rates over time, right? Cases per 100,000 people over time during the pandemic, several waves of pandemic. Second is the neighborhood census profile, that where we have the census 2016 here, prior to the pandemic, that in terms of like in each neighborhood, the percentage of low income, percentage of low education, and then percentage of people who live in crowded housing. And also social capital study, that they have measures of different forms of social capital. So in the literature, like trying to explain the effect of racial minority concentration of infections, one is like, we discussed about this earlier on, one is socio-demographic traits, right? That's about what kind of people live in that particular neighborhood. And second is also explanation for the built environment, for example, the housing, right? Or the green space, or the hospitals, access to those key resources, right? So the built environment. And then there also vaccination rates, right? But we explained that vaccination is not the main explanation here, because the pattern is documented long before vaccines become available. And then after, racial and ethnic minorities show higher rates of vaccination rate. So vaccination is not the explanation. So I'm thinking about the role of social capital, right? So there's no research so far here in Canada and in the US already explaining the role of social capital in mediating the association between minority concentration and the COVID-19 infection, right? But this, of course, very established pattern is that social capital matters for COVID-19 outcome, right? So that's one very established pattern. Second pattern is like long-standing research has suggested that social capital always lower in terms of different forms, always lower among places where there are more racial and ethnic minorities, right? So we just bring this two together, trying to really think about the role of social capital in mediating the association, right? So the mediation analysis is very simple. My key outcome variable is just the COVID-19 infection rate as a function of percentage of visible minority in that neighborhood, and then mediate by three forms of social capital: trust, norms, and networks. And controlling that the main explanation in literature, which is socioeconomic vulnerability, right? So some neighborhood are more vulnerable socioeconomically, and that is the inequality in general, that main explanation, right? So because I only look at 140 neighborhoods, so its sample size is quite small, so I tend to not include too many variables. So to capture the socioeconomic vulnerability, I create a PCF, principal component factor analysis, try to bring those variables together and then turn it into a latent variable that capture the socioeconomic status, including low percentage for low education, low income, and then crowded housing, right? So then bring three variables, turn it into a more like a index of socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. And social capital measures, including ABC, three forms, three dimensions. One is trust, right? So one is trust, including four kind of questions. One, general trust, group trust, institutional confidence, sense of belonging, and B is network, more like relational, right? So it's a combination of different types of network, family connection, friends, friendship, and then all those type of nature of the connection. And then finally is more like a civic capital, highlighting the norms, social norms that people willing to, for example, do something for common good and political engagement, or willingness to intervene when something bad happens in the neighborhood. So that capture the norms of the community, right? So three dimensions of social capital. And here is just a very simple summary statistic focusing on 140 neighborhood in the city of Toronto. Okay, so quickly, key finding. So here is that I look at 4 different times, right? So first wave is July 2020, kind of like early pandemic when vaccines were not available at that time, right? So racial minority concentration is positively related to COVID infection rate, right? And the relationship becomes stronger and stronger when the pandemic become like the cases, as the cases, number of cases increase, right? So you see the relationship correlation goes from 0.32 to 0.57, right? Close to 0.6 is quite strong relationship. And July 2021 is almost 0.6, right? The association. And the final is the December, right? I didn't look into the new data simply because like at the end of last year, we stopped, like Canada and almost everywhere, we stopped testing people, or people not, when they even get infected, they're not going to report and get tested, right? Not anymore because we lost the track of the numbers, right? So using the older data, more accurate, capturing the relationship and the different points during the pandemic will help us to kind of establish a stronger estimation about how they are related and what's the role of social capital. And this is just like a scatter plot between racial minority concentration and the index that created, the socioeconomic vulnerability index, combine 3 variables, right? So you see there's a huge positive association that concentration is related to higher levels of neighborhood vulnerability, right? So this is just simple, a control variable in my analysis. And then this is racial minority concentration, and then three forms of social capital, right? So this is also very well established that places where there are more racial and ethnic minority, social capital in terms of trust, norms, networks are lower in those neighborhoods, right? So those are very well established fundings. Here is the key fundings, right? So back into the analysis, mediation analysis formula is here. What I'm trying to look at is that the infection rate as a function of percentage of minority, and then the mediating role of 3 forms of social capital, and are separate by 3 time points, right? So we can look at in July 2020, early in the pandemic, we show that racial minority concentration is negatively related social capital, and the racial minority concentration is related to infection rates, and then social capital is also related to infection rates, right? So in terms of the mediation analysis, the step 1, step 2, step 3, right? So you can see at the top of, at the bottom of here, step 1 is positive, right? So the X is the minority concentration, and then affect the social capital level. And step 2 is the social capital and then the main outcome. And step 3 is the minority concentration and then the COVID-19 infection rate, right? So using the 2 different testing, we show that social trust matters, mediate the association. Social norms mediate association, but social network is not mediating the association, right? So, and then the pattern is consistent across 3 time points, right? So very simple is that I use 2 different mediation testing, and then they consistently show that trust and norms mediate the association between minority concentration and infection rate, but not network dimension, right? And then I repeat the analysis 4 times, and then the pattern is quite consistent. And then this is just a visualization of the main results, right? So this is July 2020, and then you can see the first two panel, trust matters, trust norms matters. So this ACME is the indirect impact of trust, right? So the minority concentration and the COVID infection going through ACME is the indirect mediating effect of trust. You see the matters, norms matters, but not network. July 2022. Same pattern, the indirect effect, significant for trust, significant for norms, but not significant for network, right? And then very, very similar patterns across the time points, right? So this demonstrates that really social capital in the forms of trust and norms significantly mediate the effect of minority concentration on infection rate, but not the network, right? So in general, the conclusion is different forms of social capital play different unequal roles, right? Different forms. And over time, social capital also play unequal roles, right? So during early on and then later, more recently, the role of social capital is smaller than during more in the middle, well, this more severe infections, right? And then also think about why trust and norms matter. So this is also inconsistent with earlier research that trust and norms matters more, because when we think about trust and norms, we conceptualize those in a more positive ways, right? When people trusting each other, when people have this collective or like are willing to intervene when something bad happens, those norms can play more positive roles, right? But when we think about network, the network dimension, people are connected to each other. Yes, it's important, but the key message here is that network can be used to do good and bad things, right? And network can reflect bad connection and then positive or negative connections, right? So the network dimension of social capital and then can have different effect than other more positive forms, right? So it's really, really thinking about the networks dimension of social capital is that really what the people use that network to do what, and then what kind of like position individual are in that network relationship, right? So very, very important to separate the network dimension to trust and the norms. In sociology, like in political science and sociology, one group of scholars, they focus more on those trust and norms, social capital, and the other, for example, Lin Nan, they focus more on network dimension in terms of job market and access to those relationships, 关系 in Chinese kind of context, right? So the network. So there's also two group of scholars researching about different dimensions of social capital. Finally, it's like really highlighting the contextual, context matters in terms of time, in terms of, for example, I talk about the institutional context, how that context could moderate, right? Moderate the effect of social capital in shaping the outcome. Okay, so that's pretty much about what I hope to share for today.
Great, thanks very much, Cary. Fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed walking through that data and seeing how those different relationships were emerging. And I posted in the chat a question because it seems to be striking that networks in this particular context, networks don't really matter. Like you're saying, networks are, they're present in all different sorts of contexts, and that can be used towards positive or negative ends. And so if we were measuring social capital just purely based on the existence of networks or network configurations, then it seems like in this context, we may have missed that relationship altogether.
Yes, and in some other research, actually, I showed that network could create negative impact, could lead to higher infection, right? So especially networks sometimes can indicate more activities and more connections, right? So when you have more friends, like it's difficult to do quarantine when you have no friends, right? So that kind of aspect of network connection could lead to more infections. There's some other research also indicate. So in this case, I show that network at neighborhood level does not really matter, but some other work showing that network, for example, at county level, create positive impact. It increase the infection, right? So the thing is that when people are more connected, then there's more activities going on, then that lead to higher infection rate. Patrick.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry,
go ahead,
shall
Patrick.
I go? Yeah, sorry. So I'm just wondering, when we talk about, so infection is obviously it's a phenomena that we sort of think about when we think about COVID initially, yeah. But I'm just wondering if you have any comments more about sort of thinking about community resilience to COVID, right? So as you say, if you've got less ability to isolate yourself, you have to go to work, even though your employers are less sort of scrupulous. And as we found in the UK, in a lot of my immigrant communities, there were workplaces where people just ignored the employers ignored the regulations. People were going to work anyway, etc. So there are a lot of factors which would mean that are not actually to do with the community social capital, that would mean that they would get more infection, okay? Because public health measures, and it's nothing to do with the individual, it's nothing to do with their social network, it's actually to do with their employment situation, yeah? And their living arrangements. They live much closer to, they often have larger families and live much closer to them. So rather than sort of, pulling that apart, because I guess that's complicated, I'm just thinking about, what about other measures of resilience to COVID, yeah? So, and I'm thinking about resilience in terms of even if you are infected, resilience to, getting food delivered, mutual support, maybe mental health resilience and things like that. So in those cases, I'd imagine the networks do sort of matter, and I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that, maybe.
Thank you, Patrick. This is really a good comment, thinking about really in the literature, that's the main explanation, right? So the picture you just outlined is really the main explanation for why certain neighborhoods tend to have more infections. It's really related to the, for example, unemployment rate or the nature of work. So for example, racial disadvantaged people in certain neighborhoods like more likely to engage, for example, care workers or even like food delivery during pandemic. And then they are more likely to take public transit in Canada, in big cities, because they don't drive. So then there's higher exposure to infections, right? And those like socioeconomic vulnerability, right? And then that's why I include the as a main control variable, really thinking that all those socioeconomic disadvantage, it is like I shown in the models, is like very strong impact on infection rate, right? But I'm here trying to, this also, that's norms, not just the norms, that is long-standing norms, right? So when we think of the social capital at collective level, it's not like, okay, during the pandemic, social capital at the collective level increase or decrease, but it's something about the neighborhood that's long-standing for decades. This neighborhood is this neighborhood. So I'm trying to do research about social capital in that sense. But yes, I agree. All those socioeconomic vulnerability, access to hospitals, or like the demographics that people, what kind of work people do.
I guess it's the other way around. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think. So is your argument that social capital is low? Is your argument social capital is lower, and therefore, and that's an additional factor then? Is that what you're saying, or are you? I'm confused now. So you're saying it's lower. I'm just wondering about the ability to sort of distinguish between it, because it's sort of, the bonding capital. It's a bit. It does feel a bit of a catch-all, doesn't it? Social capital, when you think of how a migrant, an immigrant community, maybe second-generation immigrant community is. It's almost like it says, well, depending what spatial granularity you measure that social capital, and bridging and bonding is sort of, you know, the bonding capital is, there's a very strong proximal bonding capital, but maybe slightly weaker, you know, or it's about the density of the social capital spatially. Do you get what I mean? So I'm just wondering, it feels like that sort of spatial granularity of the social capital would be a factor that might interact with this sort of response to COVID. You know, I don't know. You know, you're an expert. I'm not. I'm just wondering. You know.
Yeah. So two things. One is, yes, you're right. I've been researching about additional, right? So additional to those vulnerability, social capital is something that is could create impact for infection. So that first. And second thing is that, yes, social capital is really, really difficult to conceptualize, with to define or to narrow down, right? So in my research, I really focus on the specific 3 forms, right? And then those questions from the social capital study really, I think is a good measures of different forms, right? Even one trust, we combine multiple indexes of different group trust, generalized trust, political trust. And then when we think about network, we have friendship and then family connections and other activities. And then the norms we have, like whether people willing to do certain things. So that's, but there are other forms of social capital as well, right? And then also thinking about ways of measuring that bridging, bonding, and whatnot.
I guess, because I guess when it's sort of, when we think of trust, taking that as an example, that, so we can talk about trust and people can come up with subjective judgments of trust. But when you're talking about mapping it to a concept like COVID and outcomes, the question is, do different groups map trust spatially different? Yeah, do you get what I mean? So I might think high level of trust because there could be someone I have no interaction with, but I would trust them in my community because of the nature of the bonds and the cultural traditions and whatever, Now, in quite a different ethnic community, I would never have that trust. Do you get what I mean? Because my sort of collective, you know, it's a nature of collectivism that trust might spring greater. Do you get what I mean? Whereas in a typical sort of white English community, people would be like, well, I don't trust them because I don't know them and I don't, you know, there aren't those bonds. So I'm just thinking, even trust has a spatial dimension to it, which varies culturally. Do you get what I mean? So I'm just wondering if that is a confounding factor when you're trying to do this sort of analysis. Trust is very similar to like as on its own, right? So when we think about this spatial distribution of trust, like in UK or in Europe, in Canada, so they're related, for example, the neighborhood level related to diversity, right? So even though we say diversity is good, but all the empirical work showing that in places where there's more diversity, trust is lower, right? So that related to, and it's also the case that this trust is lower. It's not like this year is lower, next year is going to go up. It's long-standing. It's really something about the collective nature of that space. I guess more what I was thinking is if you imagine someone who's, you know, there's 4 people between you, 4 connections between you and someone, actually in terms of strong connections. In a more collectivist community, there might be for the same level of trust, you might be happy being not so proximal to them in terms of your social relations. Do you get what I mean? That's what I sort of meant by distribution of trust. I wasn't thinking of trust in overall trust. I'm just meaning how proximal you are to someone could vary depending on your sort of cultural traditions. Do you get what I mean? And I was thinking, if that is different, same level of trust, but actually this level of trust would mean that you're quite proximal, and this would be. So I was just thinking that might relate to interacting with an analysis of COVID and things like that. Because
So conceptualizing trust can be at individual, right? So the concept you're doing is really more relational than more individual and more particularized, right? So I trust this English-speaking people, or you trust this people from the same group, right? But my conceptualization here is more like generalized, or like the group collective, not the specific trust, right?
Okay. but they must be related in some way. So yeah, sorry, I've said too much. That's great. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Finally, trust is so incredibly complex. Some research that I was reading was looking at immigrant communities and how some migrants were trying to disassociate with other people from their background and try to integrate more, and so they were almost deliberately trying to position themselves with other people. This was in New Zealand with other particularly white people in New Zealand, and this was really breaking down a lot of what would have been a strong social capital and bonds of similarity with the migrant communities. And so I think that trust can be so incredibly complex. We might see high indicators of distrust in a particular society, but at the same time, we might find really strong indicators of trust within small groups, family or extended family levels. And so it's just incredibly complex to try to dig into this. And I guess that's a kind of a question for you, Cary. I know Telly's got a question as well, but like, how do we try and explore these causal relationships that seem to be incredibly complex? I mean, the relationship between trust and social concern, for example, like how do we see which way round that works? Does trust come first and lead to social concern, or is it actually, an inbuilt kind of empathy that starts with social concern and actually leads to trust? Or does it matter which way around it goes?
Very, very good question. When we think about trust or social capital and the COVID outcome, we always think about which comes first, right? So trust and then social capital could, for example, prepare individuals, communities better respond to the COVID. But COVID is also a crisis pandemic. Those negative relationship experience, hardship, losing job and losing family members, or that could damage people's trust and then like willingness to reach out, connect, right? So yes, they can go both ways. And then I last year I have a research in social science research. I used the panel data, right? So we have collected over like 2 years of panel data, asking people's trust and then also their experience with COVID-19. And then we used kind of latent variable. In Canada, we show that the different trajectories of trust. This before the pandemic and during the pandemic. For example, some Canadians have become more trusting. So we focus on the same group of Canadians, panel data. So we find almost 60% of Canadians have become more trusting. And then there's also about 20% have been more stable. And there's a group of Canadians have decline in their social trust, right? So we see even within the population, we see different trajectory of change in social trust. Right, so that related to the unequal impact of the pandemic. People respond or experience the pandemic in different ways, and that lead to differential impact, right? But my other research mainly focusing on the trust and social capital as a predictor. So really, social trust and social capital create conditions for individuals and also for communities to better respond to the pandemic, right? So for this study, I'm saying that neighborhood level. So it's very important to think about at neighborhood level and at individual level in terms of the social trust. For example, Tristan, your work, for example, I read some of your work, you highlighted that at individual level, trust or social capital could be more could change more over time, but at collective level, it takes time, right? For a community to change. Low trust community or high trust community will become more stable, right? So in that sense, my conceptualization in this particular study is really, and also is 2018 data showing the parental neighborhood, so it's way before the pandemic, right? So and how that really related to the pandemic infection rates after 2 years, right? So two things. One is community level, social trust and capital can be more stable, can be really norms that is more stable, more rigid. And then how that predict the COVID outcome. So that in that sense, I would say social capital and trust in this case come first, then before COVID-19 outcome. Right? But at individual level and in the future, we will definitely see that like places where people experience the pandemic more severely, or like the hardship, and in countries or cities, in communities that could damage the collective nature of the city as a whole, right? So we will see that kind of relationship. So it's this kind of relationship, it's bidirectional relationship between these two concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. Tilly, do you want to ask your question?
Well, it's more like an observation. As I'm sure there's a question that will emerge. Right. Okay, given that COVID has highlighted and exacerbated structural inequalities that have been persistent, I'm just wondering whether using the concept of social capital to try and make sense of COVID is useful. Okay, for example, in terms of trust, and we need to look at it from an historical perspective, in terms of colonial and post-colonial historical facts, particularly in Canada, in the UK similarly, there was the similar issues. There's that. So to just talk about the concept, use the concept of trust is high or low. Well, you need to look at historically. That's been, you have to look at it within that history and structural racism that people have experienced. And within that, there's a lack of recognition of those of the migrant communities. And equally, in terms of the spread of infections and testing, actually, it isn't in their interest to get tested, because to get tested means they will have to be isolated, they won't be able to work, they have no income. I mean, so that is a survival activities, even though it's, what you do in kindness. If you're within a survival, because the pandemic was about collective and individual survival. And where there is structural racism and there's lack of support for a particular community, so they will, keep playing out their own survival activities. To feed themselves and their families. So I'm not sure that using social capital and trust without this contextual, even in fact, to use critical race theory to help you make sense of that, I think will be useful. We've accepted that network theory, where you're supposed to be isolating, it's not going to work. And even if you try to use network theory in terms of the use of online communications in these communities, access to technology is also poor because of they don't have the resources to communicate online like we're doing at the moment. I mean, for example, teaching at my university, we went online teaching within 2 weeks of even actually 2 weeks before the lockdown in the UK, and our students were having to use their PC to share their PC with their children. So they've been disadvantaged from that experience. So that's an example of what I'm trying to say in terms of the lack of, because of the structural racism, lack of recognition. So, maybe using the theory of recognition, honest theory of recognition, and the debate between Fraser and Honest, and redistribution or recognition might be useful in terms of trying to make sense of the pandemic. As I'm actually been teaching in this area using critical theory and critical race theory in terms of assessing effective responses to health and social care issue, looking at the pandemic as a health and social care issue and to assess the effectiveness of responses.
Thank you. I really like this critical aspect of thinking, like how were those like more measurable variables related to COVID, but we need to think about structurally, historically, right? So I really like this. Thank you for sharing that. And then also, like when I'm writing up the research, I also focus on those structural, historical, right? So there's a lot of research, for example, focusing on vaccination rate is lower among racial ethnic minorities. And then one main explanation is, okay, they're less willing to get themselves vaccinated, right? But the key thing is really like trust. Even though trust, social capital, but they provide an opportunity to bring those together, right? So think about trust. Why people are less willing to get tested among racial and ethnic minority, or like you mentioned that they just, it's a survival, or like they're less willing to trust the medical institution, medical establishment, right? So this reflection of like long history of, for example, those bias and medical mistreatment in the US and Canada, right? So thinking about how institutions that mistreat people of color or like minorities, and that long-standing discrimination, mistreatment lead to that lower trust in political institutions and also in other people, right? So in US or in Canada, for example, we always see trust is lower among Black Americans. In Canada, we trust is lower among Indigenous people and people in Quebec, for example, something that is very difficult to understand why in Canada, a country, we have significant trust gap between people of Quebec and then people of the rest of Canada, right? And that related to all the things that you mentioned about the colonial history, even the war, or those structural, historical reasons that created those trust patterns and social capital patterns, even though social capital can be conceptualized from a more rational perspective. But my research shows that really it's not the rational aspect of social capital matters. It's really more about the cognitive or like the cultural, relational, for example, trust and norms, right? So that is more long-standing feature of the communities that matters more than rational conception. Okay, you have network, and that network in this case doesn't really matter. Just like you mentioned, that really the connection, or like the more rational connection, or like more individual connection might not the reason, but the reason underlying those relationship is more that deep, like in the structural, and then that create trust patterns and the norms, inequalities in trust, right? So very critical, and I really like this type of interpretation. So it's not that simple, like empirical relationship, but really speak back to all those demographics and how people and how the social groups, inequality in social groups, right? And that systematic and then structural.
So I think that sometimes there seems to be a tendency when we're talking about, like, say, vaccination rates amongst certain groups, to assume that trust or lack of trust is the driver of low vaccination rates. And I think what we've seen in New Zealand, for example, amongst the Māori people particularly, is that it's not necessarily a lack of trust, but perhaps there's a range of other factors that are actually playing an important role in what was initially, at least, relatively low vaccination rates compared to the rest of the population. So it might be simply that people are busy and they don't have time to go and get vaccinated, or you know, you can think of a wide range of different factors that may play a role. But I think the government and I think quite a lot of Western science points to distrust as the primary driver of that slow uptake of vaccination. But I think it's very difficult to try to identify the causality and the reasons that are there. Like you're saying, Cary, like we tend to fall towards the rational approach, the calculation of self-interest, that if you're not doing it, then the reason must be that you're distrusting, because of course you should do it. And it just becomes this cost-benefit analysis almost kind of calculation, whereas we don't necessarily take into account all of those cultural belief systems, norms, those more subtle factors that perhaps play a really important role as well.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Yeah, really, not the rational aspect, really more like the deeper social factors and norms that play major roles shaping all those inequality and also those COVID outcomes.
Yeah, so I have one more question, but I'd like to open it up for other people who haven't yet asked any questions. Feel free to post in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we'd be very happy to hear questions or comments from you. Just give you a moment to ask a question if you'd like to, otherwise I have at least one more. Well, perhaps we can have one more after my question. So Cary, mine is a very broad question. If you could continue this research and you were given a very large pool of money to do kind of whatever you want, what would the focus of that research be? What would you want to look at going forward?
This is a great question. Last year I went to Washington, D.C. to participate on a documentary with Putnam. And the documentary will come out next year on Netflix. But then the key thing I was asked was the same question, that what you're going to do if you have time and then money and then to continue to do research about social capital and trust. So that my answer is that really is continue the work you have been doing right now. It's really clarify the concept. Right? So think about over 20 years since Putnam, at least, that so many people across universities, and here, for example, you're from different countries and places, we spend so much time researching on this one concept, right? But still, we are, in terms of conclusion, right? We're still not very clear about what is social capital, how social capital create impact, right? So it's still not very clear in terms of the role of social capital in shaping the outcome. But people here, for example, around the world, we spend so much time and resources researching about this, right? And Teddy mentioned about maybe we are in the wrong direction, highlighting the effect, not that simple, right? So the key thing I would do is really to do those conceptual or really measuring or thinking about what is social capital. And so the three things: one is the forms, right? What are the major forms? And the second is what the levels. And then third is how context matters, right? So then create a really theorize social capital that is more useful, right? But right now it's still not clear. It's still not very useful, right? So that's we are doing social capital research, but there's two types of scholar. One is people who are doing social capital. The other is people who are not doing social capital. And then people who are not doing social capital, they always think, okay, you are doing social capital research, so you're not a good researcher, right? So a lot of time we are saying this way, yes. Right? A lot of people doing social capital research, but there's people that say, okay, doing social capital because social capital is useless as often. So something that I would like to do if continuing doing those kind of work is really focusing on that what is social capital, level, forms, and how context matters in theorizing the concept.
Yeah, I guess a related question is, Bob Putnam defined social capital as features of social organization and then provided 3 examples of that. And it seems like over the years, people have really focused in on those 3 examples that he gave, and kind of ignored the fact that he was talking about social organization in a more broader sense, and that those examples were only 3 examples of the whole thing. Social organization is much more. And so I wonder whether or not we kind of need to go back to that original idea of social organization and the way that society is organized, and stop focusing so exclusively on the 3 things that were mentioned as examples of that. I mean, do you think that would help to really dig into what social capital really is, rather than these 3 examples?
I agree, right? So when we think about the concept, right, it's originally it's really from the economics, really thinking about social capital first used in economics, that the paper thinking about why, for example, racial minorities has the same education, but have the different return to education or from workforce. So that's where social capital, the concept, comes in, right? It's not from Putnam originally, but from economics, thinking about, okay, gender, for example, men and women go to the same school, get the same education, but in return, women tend to have lower return to schooling, to education. Why? So it's not human capital, because education is a human capital. Then they have the same level of human capital. Then why there's differential return? And that's where the concept of social capital comes in, right? There's something about social capital that condition the effect of education in economic return, right? And something about, but what is that something? It's difficult to say. Putnam's point that building up on this idea, or Coleman actually building up, this is really about the networks, norms and trust, right? So the Coleman, but really, like you mentioned, those are just 3 common things. Probably Putnam and Coleman just, okay, those are 3 more direct measures of social capital. But the idea of social capital is that something that is conditioned the creation of human capital, or the return of, for example, education or skills, right? For example, you and me have the same skills, but probably you're making more money than me. The transformation of the skill, you are doing better. And you have something that is different from me, help you lead to greater transformation of your skills. And that's something called social capital, different from human capital. And that social capital, maybe not norms, maybe not just norms, not just trust, not just networks. Maybe there's some other stuff, right? Or maybe there's a better way of theorize that thing that lead to greater transformation of human capital, right? So that's, yes, going back to those original idea about social capital is the starting point, maybe not from Putnam, but from a little early on than Putnam.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a huge demand for that, and I guess it's very difficult for academics, especially, to focus and to do that work, because it's not as empirical, it's not as publishable. Perhaps you can't produce it as quickly. It requires more thought and more effort to produce. And I think there's a lot of interest in doing it still. I think we need, for the concept to be effective and useful going forward, we need to prioritize that kind of work as well.
I agree, yes.
All right, are there any other questions from anybody else? I have a feeling Cary and I could talk conceptually for hours, but that might not be terribly interesting for everybody else. Any final questions? No, I think we'll end the recording, but feel free to stay online, everybody, if you'd like to, for a little while, for some informal connection. Perhaps you can identify some opportunities for collaboration and build some social capital. But Cary, thanks very much for your presentation. It was really fascinating, and we really appreciate you giving it for us today and all the time it took for you to prepare. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.